just invite you to turn back to Psalm 19 and to look over the first few words there. What I've done is just prepared a few slides of some images from creation, because I thought, as classy as this industrial chic Salisbury State School is, it's hard to capture the beauty of creation within here. So I just prepared a few kind of slides to help you reflect on Psalm 19. Hopefully all this apparent technology will work. These are from NASA. Here is some planets and systems in the Milky Way. See if you can track this. That's the sun. And these are other stars in the Milky Way. You can't even see our sun now, or you can just see it. They're all done proportion to size. That little dot is our sun next to the star VY Canis Major, which is one of the stars you can see, I think, in Orion's sword. And then just a couple more images to go. Hopefully this set also works. All these are unfiltered. I found unfiltered photos across the web. Just take a moment to read the first half of Psalm 19. I thought it would be useful to reflect on that because as we look at Romans 1, and I'm about to lead us in prayer, the question we're asking is, what's wrong with humanity? Which is bleak, but it's set against the question of what we should have known, what we should have seen, and what we should have understood. And a big part of that is the evidence of God in creation. So we're thinking about what's wrong with humanity. There's an outline. You can get from the QR code. You can scan that on your phone now if you want, or it's up the back. And I try and put it on our community Facebook group as well. Let me lead us in prayer. Father Almighty, as we come to this important passage in Romans, but also a very difficult passage, open up our hearts and minds to receive your truth. We ask you to work by the power of the Holy Spirit for us to hear it and accept it, even if it's difficult. Pray these things in Jesus' precious name. Amen. You ask God, what's wrong with humanity? I don't know if you saw the news this other week of the shooting of school children in Nashville. Do you think sometimes what's wrong with humanity? I read the newspaper on Saturday. There's 10,000 ISIS soldiers being imprisoned since the fall of ISIS in 2019 with no plan of trial or repatriation. No one quite knows what to do with them. What's wrong with humanity? Did you know that there's still people in Guantanamo Bay from the actions of the American government in response to September 11, which was when? In 2001. What's wrong with humanity? And both sides of that. What is it that led people into terrorism? And what is it that led to such a harsh response? And why can't we do something about it? Have you ever just wondered what's wrong with humanity? But perhaps you've also asked, what's wrong with me? Why do I keep doing the things I do? Why do I keep thinking the things I think? Why can't I do the things that I want to do? And why can't I stop doing the things that I keep doing? Or perhaps your question is more, what's wrong with you? I don't know if you've ever felt that, but someone has in your life or family circle, friendship or at work has done something so dangerous, so bizarre, so damaging that the question you ask is not kind of just, oh gee, that was bad or that was terrible. The question you kind of can't help but ask is, what's wrong with you? Have I captured the tone right? What is wrong with you, Steve? Well, there we go. Have you felt that? What's wrong with me? What's wrong with you? What's wrong with the world? Well, the Apostle Paul is about to lay that answer out. And he's not doing that to give us a bad day, but it's pretty countercultural. We're encouraged to kind of see the best in ourselves, to rise up because of good self-esteem, to see that we can go from good to great. So this is an incredibly countercultural passage. And Paul is a Jew, and he's writing to the Christians in Rome, and he's trying to reveal the true state of the ancient pagan world. He's trying to reveal where the world goes and where it's gone without God. Some of this will resonate. Some of it might feel a little bit distant, because actually we live in a culture that's been shaped by Christianity for 2,000 years. But Paul is trying to expose the darkness of the human heart without God. He's answering, what's wrong with me? And the first sentence is a kicker. Wrath revealed. Look at me in verse 18. He says, for God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and unrighteousness of people. We're still answering the question, what's wrong with humanity? He says, God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and unrighteousness of people who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. Since what can be known about God is evident among them because God has shown it to them. That's a phrase that makes us squirm, isn't it? It makes me squirm, that God's wrath is revealed from heaven. It's uncomfortable that the loving God would actually be directly revealing his wrath. And the Bible makes it clear here with the languages carefully. God's wrath is revealed from heaven. This isn't just kind of cause-effect built into the earth. This is the personal involvement of God. And it's not just will be revealed, it's is revealed. It's unfolding now. Yes, God's wrath will be in the future, but it's unfolding now. Why would God be revealing his wrath now? Follow the logic of the sentence. God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all godlessness and unrighteousness of people who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth about God. See verse 19, since what can be known about God is evident because God has shown it to them. The truth that we suppress in our wickedness is the truth about God. We'll talk about how that unfolds more, but let me see if we can illustrate why that makes God so cross. Imagine for a moment that you think you're an orphan. You're not an orphan, but you think that you're an orphan. You think that your parents don't love or care for you. They think that they've deserted you and left you. How did you come to think this? Because the people around you told you were an orphan. And every time you mentioned or raised the idea that you might have parents or you might have a loving father or a loving mother, they were like, no, it's just not true. They don't exist. It's not possible. And if they were there, they don't love you. Well, the Bible says that's what we've done. Look at verse 18. See, God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and unrighteousness of people who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth about God's existence. What this is saying is that, and here's the twist in the tale, we, humanity, have suppressed the truth about God to ourselves and each other. We are that orphan. And we think that God doesn't care and God doesn't love and he's not knowable. And why do we think that? Not because God's not trying to make himself known, but actually because we suppress the truth about God. See, this is Paul's savage critique of the ancient pagan world. Wrath, God, and God is cross. Because can you imagine if you really did have a child and you wanted them to know you, and every time you approached them, they were afraid of you, or they believed you didn't exist. They wanted nothing to do with you because all the people around them said, he's not your dad. He doesn't care about you. You don't have parents. They don't love you. That's why God's wrath is revealed, because what we've done is cut ourselves off from God. Let's look at it a little more closely. See, it's truth suppressed. Look at verse 20. It says this, for his, God's, invisible attributes, that is his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen since the creation of the world, being understood through what he has made. It recognises God is a spirit. God is immortal. God is eternal. He's invisible. He's not like this creation. This creation you can see and touch and feel and poke. God's not of that order. But he's made himself perfectly clear from what? From what we clearly seen. From what's seen in the creation of the world. And what should we have seen? What humanity should have seen? His eternal power and divine nature. How best to illustrate this? So many ways, right? For the film Blue Planet 2, has anyone seen the Blue Planet documentary? Oh, you've got to watch it. Yeah, a few people nod. Oh, thank goodness. Fantastic, right? And they filmed Blue Planet 2, trying to capture, the ocean and all the incredible complexity of the ocean, nature and ocean together. They filmed for more than 6,000 hours underwater. Think about that, being under water for 6,000 hours. I think there was something like 25 expeditions across 39 countries. And do you know how much they captured of the sea life and ocean life and sea creatures? Tiniest little bit. You watch those 2.5 hours of video, I think it's about that long, and it blows you away. And do you know what you've seen in creation? Nothing. The smallest speck of all the complexity and wonder and intricacy of creation. And we're seeing this more and more. The more we discover in science, the harder it is, I reckon, to ignore the existence of God. In the most ordinary cells, I've said this before, but in the most ordinary cells, they are discovering those cells have more interrelated parts than the most complex human factories ever created. Remember in year 7 when you had to draw a cell? And you were like, circle, bonk. Yeah, it has a perimeter. I can't remember the name of it anymore. And then it's got these two kind of things inside it. That bit, that bit. I've drawn a cell! Actually, no, you haven't. You haven't even come close. Take, let's say, Sony. Think about what must go on in a factory, a Sony factory, to make phones and computers. And then think of all the incredible roles and complexity of the machines and all the soldering and all the circuits and all the gold involved and all the programming. And now draw your cell. So that's when we look at the tiniest thing. When we look at the vastness of the world, there's this thing called the cosmological constant, and it's like how all physics works, basically to make the universe work. And how does the universe work such that life can exist? How do those constants come about and the probabilities come about? A philosopher says this. He says, the probabilities of life coming from the fine-tuning of the universe is 1 part in 10 to the power of 120. What's the power of 10 to 120? I don't know either. There's only 10 to the power of 80 molecules in the universe. Put that into scale. See, creation ought to make us go, God must be eternal in power and divine in nature. And where does this leave us? Look at the end of that verse. End of verse 20. From creation, without microscopes and telescopes, Paul says, as a result, people are without excuse. People are without excuse about the knowledge of God. See, because what we did is we made the worst exchange we could have made. Look at verse 21. For although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or show gratitude. Instead, their thinking became worthless and their senseless hearts were darkened. What's the exchange? Verse 22. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, birds, four-footed animals, and reptiles. It's saying God has revealed enough of himself in creation that we could grasp enough of God's nature that there's no way that we should have thought anything in creation would match him. Not even close. Xenophanes, the ancient Greek writer, was really cross with Homer. You know, Homer wrote up all the stories about the ancient gods because he said Homer made all those ancient gods just look like jumped up humans. And Xenophanes said, no, there's one God, supreme among gods and men, who is like mortals in neither body nor mind. Xenophanes got it. If there's a God, he's not going to be like anything in creation. But what did we do instead? We exchanged the glory of God for idols. Humanity worshipped created things. That's what idols are. Created things. But look at that verse. It says, we knew God. For although they knew God, we did not glorify him or show gratitude. Now, glorifying sounds very religious. It simply means to recognize the greatness of someone. I know it sounds a bit narcissistic for God. Look at me, look at me. But that's not what's going on here, right? Let's say you were in desperate need and someone raised $1 million for you and they gave it to you. How would you relate to that? How would you relate to that? Would you put their picture on Instagram? Would you declare them on Facebook? Would you introduce them to all your friends and family? I'd like you to meet Matt. Yes, he lived in his mother's basement. But last week he just gave me $1 million to help pay for cancer treatment. Wouldn't you make him known to the world? Well, if that was true for someone who gave you $1 million, what about the God who gave you life and breath and existence and every day sustains you? Wouldn't it be right? I'd like you to meet God. We knew God. We, humanity, knew God. But what did we do with it? We decided that it was better to worship created things. Well, where does this leave us? Well, our thinking became corrupted and so were our hearts. Verse 21, instead, their thinking became worthless and their senseless hearts were darkened. Now, this is not saying that every human thought is foolish. It's not saying that we couldn't do maths anymore. What it's saying is when it came to spiritual matters, when it came to God, and when it came to what it meant to know God and honour him, we were utterly corrupted. Our thinking became worthless. Or put it in New Testament terms, utterly spiritually blind. We can't see the truth about God. So can you see the logic of it? I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it? The fact that we thought worshipping something in the place of God in creation seemed to be a perfectly reasonable idea. Doesn't that show how far we'd fallen in our thinking? See verse 22, claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, birds and four-legged animals and reptiles. And you might be thinking, oh, thank goodness I'm not like that. Those ancient people were stupid. And you're right, they were stupid. When the Israelites were led out of Egypt, God led them in a pillar of light and a cloud of fire. And then they got to Mount Sinai and Moses went up there. And after a while, 40 days had passed and the Israelites went, we don't know where Moses has gone. And we don't know where God is, even though there was probably still thunder and lightning happening on the top of Mount Sinai. So what did? They collected all the gold that they'd taken from the Egyptians. How did they get that gold? And they collected it all and they made a golden calf. And they presented it to each other. And Aaron said, Israel, these are your gods who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. I mean, think about the stupidity of that. They just made those golden calves at the foot of Sinai. How could those gods have led them to the foot of Sinai out of Egypt when they just made them from their earrings? How dumb are they, right? Thank goodness we're not like them. Or hang on a minute. Are you sure it's true that we don't worship created things? Don't some of us worship celebrities? Don't some of us in humanity worship celebrities? Wouldn't some of us die to have a date with Brad Pitt? Or at least 10 years ago when he was still handsome? Don't some of us worship beauty? Yes, I'm talking about Brad Pitt still. But have you thought about that? Have you thought about that? Beauty is what? What's currently beauty is an artificial construct, isn't it? It's not what was beautiful 100 years ago. It's not what was beauty in other nations at various times, although the world is getting more global and we're flattening beauty out ever more. But what is beauty? Beauty is something we've created, isn't it? It's an artificial construct. It's a God we've made. And yet, don't we worship the people who are currently the most beautiful people in the world? Aren't we bowing down to a God that we've just created? What about success? How is success defined? We all have a pretty shared definition of success because of the current cultural context we're in. If we'd lived a couple of hundred years ago, we would have had a different definition. If we lived in a different nation, we'd have a different definition of success. So who created that definition of success? We did. It popped out of the fire from our degrees and our efforts at work and the money we've earned and our investments. There it is, success. And what do? Well, we sacrifice employees, family members, and friends on our work desks to the God of success. Author David Foster Wallace said this, because here's something else that's true. In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshipping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. But on that last point, he's wrong. Because actually, we're so spiritually corrupted that we can't choose to worship God rightly. See, we've suppressed the truth about God so we can worship what we want to worship. And by worshipping what we want to worship, our ultimate goal is to keep ourselves as God. If we get to make the golden calf, then we have the power. If we get to decide what beauty or success or celebrity is, then it's a way of us trying to lift ourselves up. But look at the tragedy that unfolds. Look at the tragedy that unfolds in Colossians. We are delivered over. It gets repeated 3 times. NIV says gave up, given over. The CSB says delivered. There it is in verse 24. Therefore God delivered us. It's there in verse 26. For this reason God delivered them. And it's there in verse 8. Because they did not think it worthwhile to acknowledge God, God delivered them over to a corrupt mind. Here's where it kind of gets even darker. we're enslaved to the desires of our hearts. See, because we did this awful exchange, verse 24, therefore God delivered them over in the desires of their hearts to sexual impurity, so their bodies were degraded among themselves. You know, when archaeologists discovered the city of Pompeii, you know, that's the one that was covered by volcanic ash, kind of preserved ancient Greco-Roman city. You know what they discovered everywhere in that city? Hidden away in a museum until about 100 years ago. Does anyone know? Phalluses everywhere. Penises everywhere. They were on the sides of buildings to indicate brothels. They were on the walls of the artwork of the city. They were as statues in people's dining rooms. Not just the private personal rooms down the back, but the public rooms. And the archaeologists were so embarrassed about this as they discovered them that they've been hiding them away in a museum in Italy for more than 100 years. Because they were like, we look up to the Greeks and Romans, and what have we discovered about this ancient culture? Well, actually, that they were bowing down to sex. Just like us. Isn't pornography a massive industry? See what's happening here? God delivered them over to the desires of their hearts, and it led to sexual impurity. But it's general sexual impurity, and then it gets more specific. They're kind of three parallel things. Verse 25, the next set. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshipped and served what has been created instead of the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. For this reason, God delivered them over to disgraceful or dishonourable passions. The women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. And the men in the same way also left natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the appropriate penalty for their conversion of their error. It is talking about homosexuality, and it's not just talking about it being practiced without love. It's talking about the practice of homosexuality. And it's awful and hard to say that. I know, it's very countercultural. But what's going on here? I think what it's saying is, it's got, I think, in the background, the echoes of Genesis 1 and what we were made for. We were made in the image of God. God created humanity in his image. We weren't self-sufficiently in the image of God. It didn't happen by our own power and strength. It came out of the fact that we were made by God, sustained by God, and created to be like that by God. So what happened when we stepped away from God? Well, actually, in a sense, all of us is broken. If you remember Genesis 1, when God makes man and woman in his image to multiply and fill the earth with people in his image. Well, how did that happen? Well, it happened through the beauty and wonder of sexual union between a man and a woman. But because we've rejected God, in a sense, then God has given us over to broken sexuality. And it's not just, hear me say, it's not just homosexuality. In the first one, it talks in general about our sexuality, our lusts, and our overheated desires, and our inability to control our bodies or our eyes, adultery. But then he also says, look, homosexuality is an expression of this. But it's not the sin, right? Because there's one more. It's not, don't hear me saying it's the sin. I think Paul's picking on that to try and say the disorderedness. When we've let go of the God of creation, everything is disordered, including our bodies and our sexuality. There's a third giving over, though. We're enslaved to corrupt minds. See, at the start I said, have you ever wondered about your actions or desires or thoughts? Think, why do they keep going in this direction? Why, when they're so damaging, I keep thinking them or doing them? Why can't I just stop myself? Romans 1:18. Because they did not think it worthwhile to acknowledge God, God delivered them over to a corrupt mind, so they do not do what is right. You've heard the phrase of a moral compass, isn't it? You know where a compass works? It just tells you where north is, And if you know where north is, then you should be able to. You should be able to. I've been on some hiking trips where this didn't happen. But you should be able to work out where east and south and west are. But what happens if you don't know where north is? Then you have no hope of working out where east, south and west are. What this is saying is that God actually gave us over to a broken moral compass. See the logic there? So that they do not do what is right. We rejected God and his goodness and holiness, and God gave us what we desired. He said, you don't want me? Well, all goodness flows from me. I define what is holy and good and right in the world. I make the world so that it is ordered and wonderful and incredible and to be a delight. But if you don't want me, well, I can't give you my goodness that flows from that as well. And look at this list that comes. And again, this is countercultural, isn't it? The Bible says, the world says, lift ourselves up, think greatly of yourself. Well, Romans chapter 1:8, this verse slaps you down. Look what happens. They are filled with all unrighteousness and evil and greed and wickedness. They are full of envy and murder and quarrels and deceit and malice. They are gossips and slanderers and God-haters and arrogant and proud and boastful and inventors of evil and disobedient to parents and senseless and untrustworthy and unloving and unmerciful. We want to say, that's not me. So you've never boasted? You've never been proud? Never disobeyed your parents? Now, Paul lumps all these together. We'd like to separate them. We'd like to say, well, people who commit murder, they're in one category, and those who gossip or slander, they're in another. And, everyone boasts. But Paul's going, no, all of that is an outworking of broken hearts. I mean, what is gossip and slander? Isn't it the murder of someone's reputation? Isn't it the murder of the possibility of someone else having a relationship that's good with that person? The more you lean into these things, you see how damaging they are. What has greed led to? Well, think about the imperialism from Britain or America. What has greed led to? The slavery of humanity a couple of hundred years ago. Untold destruction on other races and peoples. Where is the world at? We, humanity, even rejoice in evil. Verse 32, although they know God's just sentence, that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but even applaud others who practice them. Paul says, humanity, we see enough, we have a good enough glimpse of who God is, that to see that we do this to each other is deserving death. And yet not only do we do it, we applaud people to do it. I've mentioned this before, but I think the invasion of Ukraine is a great example. What has that done in the name of? It's done in the name of Russian nationalism. Murder, rape, genocide are applauded by some, not all, thankfully, in the name of nationalism. But it's not just war, is it? You kind of lift up most of the rocks in our society. There's a lot of darkness and evil that's done in the name of the dollar, or in the name of politics, or in the name of just looking after my family. And we applaud ourselves. What this section here is talking about is the doctrine of total depravity. The doctrine is not that we can't do any good, but it's that any good that we do is tainted and corrupted so that it's not pure good. We can do some good, but it'll always be tainted and corrupted. And it's always caught up in our selfishness. Think about the current plug to give money to things. You see on Instagram, and you're encouraged to give money. Why? To help the needy or the homeless or the desperate? No, mostly it's so you feel good about yourself. So what's driving us to give money then? Entirely self-interest. We give because we care about ourselves. Why do they keep saying that then? Because it works. How to summarise this bit? C.S. Lewis put it a little bit like this. He says, those who have rejected God enjoy forever the horrible freedom that they have demanded and are therefore self-enslaved. Let me repeat it again. Those who have rejected God, and here I quote him, enjoy forever the horrible freedom that they have demanded and are therefore self-enslaved. That's pretty bleak. So why is Paul talking about it? Well, he actually wants us to understand the gospel of salvation. 3 points to conclude. See, the gospel is a diamond. I was hoping someone wealthy from Risen Church would bring... I didn't get a chili last week. I hoped for a diamond. I got this, but it doesn't quite work because it's red. Thank you though, Rachel. A diamond, right? A diamond. When do you see a diamond? What do the jewelers do so that you can see a diamond? You put it against black cloth. Because it's only when it's against the black cloth that you can actually see the sharpness and the brightness of the diamond. See, in 1:16, Paul says, I'm about to tell you the gospel. And he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel in Romans 1:16 because it's the power of God for salvation for everyone who believes. Well, in order to believe that, in order to see how bright that diamond is, he needs to help them see that they have no hope of saving themselves. That nothing they do with their religious practice or their moral practice, nothing that they can do in their cultural practice is going to bring them back into relationship with God. Yes, he's painting a dark picture, but he's trying to expose to us the blackness so that when he comes to the gospel in chapters 3 onwards, it shines brightly like a diamond. And I want to say to you, you won't hear the power of the gospel. You won't get its greatness while you continue to push away the reality of sin and wickedness and evil in the world and in your very own heart. Because it's actually when you've wrestled with this. I want to set a challenge to you. If you think you're good, pick something this week that you do that you don't like and stop it. Go on, just stop it. Because if you're good, you'll be able to stop it. But I think you'll discover that you're not good. Because if you were good, you'd just be able to stop this thing that was not good. I tried it. I discovered I was not good. I discover every week that I'm not good. Harry's talk was perfect, wasn't it? We can't change ourselves. We need the power of the gospel. What Paul is doing, he's like a spiritual surgeon. He's got the dying patient on the table and he's saying to them, there's nothing in you that can save yourself. You need something from outside of you. And it's wonderful, but it's going to hurt to take this medicine. But you desperately need it. But here's the second point. See, the language here, though, that we're going to discover in the gospel that God is at work. See, God's given humanity over to sin here. But why did he give humanity over sin? So we might see how sinful we are. So we might understand that we are away from God. In a sense, we stepped away from him. God could have left us in paradise and then we would have met him in judgment. So God in his mercy has delivered us over to stepping away from him. So we can see that. But there is another part of his plan. At the end of Luke, Jesus says this, it is necessary, referring to himself, that the Son of Man be delivered into the hands of sinful men, to be crucified and risen on the third day. God delivered humanity over to sin so that we would deliver Jesus to the cross, so that we would be delivered from sin. God's great plan in this was to deliver us from this wickedness. But he gave us over to it first. It's the very same Greek word. In Luke's gospel, it gets repeated again and again in the final chapters. When you see that, if you read through Luke's gospel, when you see that Jesus is handed over, or Jesus delivered, or Jesus is betrayed, it's this deliverance word, but God delivers Jesus into the hands of sinners so that he might be punished for sin, so that sinners might be forgiven. That's the gospel of salvation. And the third point then is that the gospel doesn't leave us here. The gospel rescues and restores. But I realize restores is not good enough. The gospel rescues, it restores, and it recreates. See, Jesus lived as the perfect man. Well, what's God's great plan in the gospel if you come under the gospel? Romans chapter 8, verse 28 says, God is at work to conform his people to the image of his Son. Same language. We were made in the image of God. We let go of that image. But Jesus comes as the pure image of God and the pure image of man. And in the gospel, we are rescued from sin. We are restored to relationship with God. But we're being recreated to be like Jesus. But to see our need for the gospel, we need to see the darkness of where we're at without God. Let me pray and then open up for questions and comments and reflections. Father Almighty, help our hearts come to grips with this truth, which is so very hard to hear. Help us hear this reality about humanity, about the world out there, about others, but also about ourselves. Help us see this answers this question of what is wrong with me. And help us turn to the gospel, the great news of Jesus' death for us. Amen.